My name is Elena Marquez. I was born April 17, 1986, in Valparaiso, Chile, and I'm a former witch who once carried out spiritual assignments specifically against believers, yes, Christians who prayed, worshipped, and trusted God. I'm not sharing a theory. I am confessing what I personally did, the rituals I performed, the surveillance I carried out, and the terrifying methods we used to identify and track believers for spiritual attacks. What I am about to reveal is not guesswork. When we are searching for people protected by God, the signs we look for when we are searching for people protected by God. So listen carefully. Before this video, comment below and share it with others immediately, because what you are about to hear will open spiritual eyes and break hidden deception. And you must watch until the very end, because the final revelation I will share is the one sign that made witches immediately retreat from certain believers. This is not entertainment. This is a confession and a warning. When I was inside witchcraft, the very first instruction we received before approaching a person was simple. Do not look at their words first. Look at their atmosphere. You may think witches are searching for strange clothing, jewelry, or symbols. That is not how it works. Real witches, especially those assigned against believers, are trained to sense spiritual environments. Because before a witch can influence a person, they must first determine whether that person is spiritually exposed or spiritually guarded. And many times the difference is visible the moment you walk into a room. I remember my first assignment clearly. It was not against an unbeliever. It was against a woman who prayed every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m. Her name was given to us during a gathering. The instruction was clear. Watch her, study her, find the open door. So I did what witches are trained to do. I began observing her public places, at the grocery store, at her workplace, at a cafe she often visited. And the first thing I noticed was something I could not explain. The atmosphere around her felt different. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but different. When witches approach someone spiritually unguarded, the environment feels neutral, sometimes even easy to manipulate. But around certain believers, something unusual happens. The atmosphere becomes resistant. You cannot see it with physical eyes, but you can feel it immediately. It is like walking into a room where someone has already taken authority. A room where something invisible is already standing guard. And the first time I experienced that, it unsettled me, because this woman was not doing anything unusual. She was simply standing in line at a store, but the space around her felt protected. Later I learned why. She prayed daily, not casually, not occasionally, daily. And witches are trained to recognize something most believers do not realize. Consistent prayer changes the spiritual environment around a person, not just during prayer, but continuously. It leaves a kind of spiritual residue. And when witches detect that residue, they immediately become cautious, because prayer creates something witches hate encountering: authority. You see, witches are not as bold as people imagine. They do not randomly attack every believer they see. They study first, they measure resistance, they test the atmosphere. And if the atmosphere feels guarded, they slow down. Sometimes they withdraw completely. I remember reporting my observation to a senior witch in the group. I said something strange was happening. Every time I get close to her, it feels like pressure in the air. The response shocked me. She said calmly, "That means she prays." Then she gave me a warning. "If you feel that pressure, do not engage too quickly. Those ones can see things in the spirit." That statement confused me at the time, but later I understood exactly what she meant. Believers who live in prayer often develop spiritual awareness. They may not call it that. They may simply say, "I felt something was wrong." But witches know what it really is. It is the result of a living connection with God. And that connection creates a protective environment around them. This is the first sign witches look for when spotting someone who could expose them. Not clothing, not appearance. Atmosphere, the spiritual climate surrounding you. And here is something even more unsettling. When witches sense that atmosphere, they begin watching you even more closely. Because a praying believer can be one of two things to them: a threat, or a target they must weaken. This is where the second phase of observation begins. Witches start studying your behavior patterns. They want to know, when do you pray? When do you become tired? When do you become discouraged? Because spiritual attacks rarely happen randomly. They happen when believers lower their guard. But the woman I was assigned to watch did something that made our entire group uncomfortable. She prayed everywhere, not loudly, not dramatically, but constantly, in the car, at work, at home, quiet prayers, short prayers, but consistent. And consistency is something which is cannot easily break, because consistency builds spiritual walls, walls that are invisible to human eyes, but painfully obvious to those operating in darkness. Eventually, the leader of our group gave a final instruction regarding that woman: leave her alone. That was rare. Assignments were not abandoned easily, but this one was. Why? Because the atmosphere around her made spiritual influence extremely difficult. And that is when I began to realize something that eventually led to my own freedom. Many believers have no idea how powerful their daily spiritual habits really are. They think prayer is just a routine, but witches see it as something very different: a defensive weapon, a protective shield, a barrier. Can turn an ordinary believer into someone the kingdom of darkness prefers to avoid. So if you want to know the first way witches spot believers when they enter a room, it is simple. They pay attention to the atmosphere around you, the unseen environment your life produces. And when that environment carries the mark of consistent prayer, witches notice immediately, even if you say nothing, even if you do nothing, even if you are simply standing quietly in a crowd. Because spiritual authority is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply present, and darkness can feel it. After a witch senses the atmosphere around someone, the next thing we were trained to observe was something very specific: your reaction, not your words, not your appearance, your reaction when darkness gets close to you. Because witches know something many believers do not realize. Darkness always tests the room first, sometimes subtly, sometimes quietly, sometimes through people, and how a believer responds to that moment tells witches everything they need to know. I remember another assignment we received years after I began practicing deeper rituals. This time the target was a man who attended church faithfully. But unlike the woman I mentioned earlier, his atmosphere was not immediately intimidating. It felt neutral, which meant the next step was necessary: observation through interaction. Witches will sometimes approach believers through normal conversations, casual meetings, small talk, friendly gestures. The purpose is simple: to see how you discern what is happening. One afternoon I encountered this man at a bookstore. It looked like an ordinary moment, two strangers standing near the same shelf. But what he did next immediately alerted me. He looked directly at me, paused, and then quietly said something I was not expecting: "God bless you." Now that phrase may sound small to you, but to someone operating in witchcraft it can feel extremely uncomfortable, because words spoken with genuine faith carry spiritual weight. Witches know when someone is simply speaking politely, but we also know when someone is speaking from conviction. And that man did not say it casually. He said it with authority, almost like he sensed something was wrong. So I responded normally. I smiled, pretended nothing was unusual, but internally I began testing him further. During conversation, witches often introduce subtle spiritual pressure, not something dramatic, but small psychological or emotional pushes, questions designed to provoke fear, statements designed to plant doubt. For example, I asked him something that witches often use as a probe: "Do you ever feel like something bad might happen soon?" This question is strategic. If the person is spiritually unaware, they usually respond with fear or uncertainty. But his response surprised me. He shook his head calmly. Then he said something I still remember clearly: "No, because my life belongs to God." That moment changed everything. You see, witches are trained to recognize when someone knows their spiritual authority. Not someone who hopes they are protected, but someone who believes it deeply. And believers who respond with calm confidence are extremely difficult to manipulate, because fear is the doorway witches rely on. Fear weakens spiritual resistance. Fear creates cracks. Fear opens doors. But when a believer responds without fear, those doors stay closed. That is why witches watch your reactions carefully. If something strange happens and your first response is panic, worry, or confusion, witches immediately recognize an opportunity. But if your response is faith, calmness, or prayer, they know they are dealing with someone who is spiritually grounded. Let me explain something many people misunderstand. Witches do not always appear threatening. Sometimes they appear friendly, helpful, normal, because the goal is never to scare you. The goal is to study you, to determine whether you are spiritually alert. And that is why your reactions matter so much. If a believer becomes easily shaken, witches see it immediately. But when a believer stands firm, speaks faith, and refuses fear, the situation changes. Because confidence rooted in faith disrupts the entire strategy. I remember reporting that bookstore encounter to the leader of our group. Her response was immediate. Did he show fear? I said no. She asked another question. Did he speak about God with certainty? I said yes. Then she said something that stayed with me for years. Then he is not easy to influence. That sentence revealed something very important. Spiritual warfare is not only about prayer, it is also about spiritual posture. How you stand, how you speak, how you respond when darkness tries to intimidate you. And witches notice that posture immediately. Some believers unknowingly reveal weakness through constant fear. Fear of curses, fear of attacks, fear of unseen forces. But the believers witches respect the most, those who refuse to surrender their confidence in God. Those believers are difficult to manipulate, difficult to intimidate, and often impossible to control. That bookstore encounter ended quickly. After a few minutes of conversation, I left. But something unusual happened as I walked away. Instead of feeling confident, I felt uneasy, because the calm authority in that man's voice made me question something I had ignored for years. Why were the people we targeted always the ones who trusted God the most? That question haunted me long after I left that bookstore, and eventually it became one of the reasons I began questioning the entire system I was part of. Because when darkness encounters real faith, it cannot easily dominate, it must retreat, and witches know that better than anyone. So if you want to understand the second way witches identify believers when they encounter them, it is simple. They watch how you react when spiritual pressure appears. Do you panic? Do you doubt? Become afraid? Or do you stand with quiet confidence in your faith? Because that reaction tells witches something powerful, whether you are spiritually vulnerable or spiritually dangerous. There is another sign witches are trained to recognize immediately. It is not something you wear. It is not something you carry. It is something you speak, your words. Inside witchcraft circles, we were taught something that many believers underestimate. Words are not just communication. Words create spiritual permission. Every day, witches listen carefully to how people speak about their lives, because your words reveal your spiritual alignment. And believers who consistently speak with faith become extremely difficult targets. Let me explain how this works. During spiritual surveillance, witches often position themselves close enough to hear ordinary conversations, not secret rituals, not dramatic confrontations, just everyday speech. What people say when they feel comfortable. Because in those moments, your real beliefs come out. I remember a time when we were studying a small prayer group that met weekly. The goal was to identify the weakest member, the person whose faith could be shaken first. Because in many witchcraft strategies, if one believer falls into fear or confusion, it can spread discouragement through the entire group. So we began listening carefully to their conversations after meetings. What we heard revealed something important. Some people spoke constantly about problems, money problems, health problems, family problems. Their words were heavy with worry, heavy with frustration, heavy with doubt. And witches recognize those patterns immediately, because words filled with defeat create open spiritual space. But then there were others in that same group who spoke differently. Even when discussing challenges, they ended their sentences with something powerful. Faith. Statements like, God will handle it. God has brought me through worse. I trust God to provide. Those words may sound simple to you, but inside witchcraft circles, statements like that are taken seriously. Because consistent faith declarations build something witches dislike encountering. Spiritual authority through speech. You see, witches believe strongly in the power of spoken words. That is why spells, incantations, and rituals involve speaking specific phrases. Because words are believed to release spiritual energy. So when believers speak words filled with faith, witches hear it as spiritual resistance. One evening during our observation, something unusual happened. A woman from the prayer group was leaving the building after a long meeting. She looked exhausted. It had clearly been a difficult day for her. One of the witches with me whispered quietly, "This one looks tired. Listen to what she says." Because tired believers sometimes speak words of defeat. But instead, she stopped near the parking lot, looked up at the sky, and said something softly. "Lord, I may be tired, but you are still in control." That moment made everyone with me uncomfortable, because it revealed something powerful. Her faith was not dependent on how she felt. It was rooted deeper than emotion. And believers who maintain faith even when they are weak are extremely difficult to break spiritually. Later that night, the leader of our group gave a simple explanation. People who speak faith consistently are building walls with their words. That sentence stayed in my mind for years. Walls with their words. Because witches know something many believers forget. Negative speech can weaken spiritual resistance. Statements like, "Nothing ever works for me," "I feel cursed," "My life is falling apart." Those words may feel like normal expressions of frustration, but spiritually they can open doors to discouragement and fear. And witches listen carefully for those doors. But when believers speak with faith instead, those doors remain closed. Something else happens too. Filled with faith often create conviction in the atmosphere. Even people operating in darkness can feel it. I experienced that personally during one encounter that changed me deeply. A believer I had been observing for weeks finally confronted me unexpectedly. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but directly. He simply said, "I don't know what you're involved in, but I pray God reveals the truth to you." He did not shout. He did not accuse. But those words carried something powerful: authority. For a moment I felt exposed. Not physically, spiritually. Because words spoken with genuine faith can carry a force that disrupts spiritual deception. And that moment stayed with me for years. It was one of the earliest cracks in the belief system I had built around witchcraft. Because I began realizing something. The people we targeted were often the ones who spoke about God the most. Not in a religious routine, but in everyday conversation, at work, with friends, in casual moments. And those words constantly reinforced their spiritual position. Eventually, I understood something that witches already knew. Your mouth reveals your spiritual foundation. If your speech constantly reflects fear, witches notice. If your speech constantly reflects faith, witches notice that too. And the difference between those two patterns can determine whether someone becomes an easy target or someone darkness prefers to avoid. So the third way witches identify believers is simple. They listen to what comes out of your mouth, because your words reveal whether you are speaking from fear or faith. And witches know exactly which one creates spiritual power. There is one final sign witches are trained to recognize. And this one is the most unsettling, because it cannot be explained through psychology. It cannot be explained through observation alone. It is something spiritual, something real, something witches feel the moment they come too close to certain believers. Inside witchcraft circles, this is often described with one phrase: the presence. Not everyone carries it. Not every believer walks in it. But when someone does, witches recognize it immediately. And many times they leave the area quickly. Let me explain what I mean. During the later years of my involvement in witchcraft, our group began studying a pastor who had become very influential in his community. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. But people around him kept experiencing powerful spiritual changes. Broken families restored. People leaving addiction. People suddenly becoming serious about prayer. To us, that was a problem. Because when one believer becomes spiritually strong, it often encourages others to grow stronger too. So we began observing him. The first thing we noticed was something unusual. Whenever he entered the room, conversations changed. People became calmer. Tension dropped. Arguments stopped. And the atmosphere felt lighter. At first, we assumed this was simply his personality. Longer we watched him, the more something deeper became obvious. He carried a spiritual influence that affected people before he even spoke. And this is what witches call the presence of spiritual authority. I remember the first time I stood close enough to feel it myself. He was speaking quietly with someone outside a building. Just a normal conversation, nothing dramatic. But when I walked within a few steps of him, something inside me reacted immediately. It felt like sudden pressure in my chest, not pain, but resistance. Almost like standing near a powerful magnetic field pushing you back. I stepped away quickly, and another witch beside me whispered something that explained everything. He carries the presence. Inside witchcraft circles, that phrase is used when someone has developed a deep relationship with God. Not surface level faith, not occasional prayer, but a life deeply surrendered. Those believers often develop a spiritual authority that darkness struggles to approach, and witches feel it, not visually, but internally. The same way believers sometimes sense when something spiritually wrong is present, witches can sense when something spiritually holy is present, and the difference is unmistakable. During one observation meeting, the leader of our group explained it very clearly. There are some believers you can influence, some believers you can discourage, but some believers carry something that makes it difficult for darkness to stay near them. That something is what they call the presence. But today I know the truth. It is the presence of God working through a surrendered life. The pastor we were studying eventually became someone our group avoided entirely. Not because he attacked us, not because he confronted us, but because the spiritual environment around him made our work extremely difficult. And that realization became one of the turning points that eventually led me to leave witchcraft completely. Because I began noticing something that could not be ignored. The believers who walked closely with God were not the ones living in fear. They were calm, confident, peaceful, even when facing challenges. And that peace created something witches could not easily penetrate: the presence. Now listen carefully. You do not develop that presence through performance. You do not develop it through pretending to be strong. It develops through relationship, through daily surrender, through prayer, through obedience, through a life that genuinely seeks God. And when that relationship becomes deep, something changes. Your spiritual authority grows, your discernment sharpens, and the presence of God begins to shape the atmosphere around you. When witches encounter believers carrying that presence, they often become uncomfortable very quickly. Sometimes they leave the conversation. Sometimes they avoid further interaction. Sometimes they abandon the assignment entirely, because darkness prefers environments where God's presence is weak or ignored, not environments where it is active and undeniable. This is why some believers unknowingly intimidate witches without ever trying. Their lives carry evidence of spiritual alignment. Their homes carry peace. Their words carry faith. Their reactions carry confidence. And their presence carries something darkness struggles to confront. When I finally left witchcraft, one of the first things I realized was how much power believers actually carry if they remain connected to God. Most believers underestimate themselves, but witches do not. They study you, they observe you, they measure your spiritual strength. And the strongest believers are not the loudest ones. They are the ones whose lives reflect a genuine connection with God. Those believers carry the presence. And when that presence becomes strong, darkness does something very interesting. It begins looking for easier targets. That is the final sign witches look for when spotting believers. Not just your atmosphere, not just your reactions, not just your words, but the presence that surrounds a life fully surrendered to God. And when that presence becomes undeniable, witches know exactly what they are standing near, something they cannot easily overcome. Now you understand why this message had to be spoken. What witches look for, what they fear, and what gives believers real spiritual authority. If this testimony opened your eyes, comment below right now, because your response confirms that this truth is reaching the people who need it. Do not keep this hidden. Share this video immediately, because someone you know may be under spiritual pressure and needs to hear this warning. And remember, you stayed until the very end for a reason, because now you know something powerful. Believers who remain close to God do not live as victims. They walk with authority, and darkness recognizes it.